Hey, JP, thank you for coming in. And, you just have a tremendous background of accomplishment. You're a distinguished professor at George Mason. You're a fellow with this academy out of Berlin, co-director of the Center for Advanced Human-Machine Partnership. You've written 10 books and over 100 articles. You're just doing a tremendous amount globally, and you've consulted with all these marvelous organizations like UNESCO and World Bank and WTO and so on. And you've founding editor of these publications. And earlier, just before us going on camera, you indicated that's the Minerva program. So we're going to mine all of this tremendous background that you have, just so much accomplishment. And, really, really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
Thank you, Stephen Ibrahim. And it's a pleasure to be here. And actually, I should say an honor to be here. Thanks for making the time and for fostering this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it. All the things that you mentioned are the standard academic things, but it's been an honor to have gone through this career and been able to contribute.
Well, JP, you've got a tremendous amount of success, and it's continuing. You're definitely making the world a better place, and you're making all of these contributions from a regional, national, international standpoint. There must have been inflection points in your life that made this wonderful career that you have and will continue to have, both from a personal and professional basis. And perhaps it happened when you were really young, maybe 5 years old or something like. Could be mentorship within your family, outside, maybe career inflection points. Can you share some of those marvelous moments that created this wonderful human being that you are?
Well, thank you very much. I could go back to 5 years old and earlier. Born in a small state in India called Himachal Pradesh. It's up north in the Himalayas, snowbound, beautiful place to grow up in the tall Himalayas. But I'm born in the early 1960s, and we are part of that post-colonial generation, which is very aspirational. My first political memory really is when Nehru died, and he is a towering figure in Indian history. So I think there was a post-colonial endeavor that shaped my generation to thinking about questions of development, about eradication of poverty. And they were immediately local questions, but they were also global questions. My father was a horticulturalist. He, in fact, introduced mushroom farming to India on a large scale. But he went to study in Germany as part of a German government project, which then became a UN development program project. FAO got involved in it. There were World Bank projects around us. So when you're growing up in that India, your thinking is being shaped by all these global institutions coming into being, and local questions are immediately sort of global questions. I think the second thing I would then say would be that prompted me to take up questions of political economy. My training was very broad and interdisciplinary. Since you mentioned people who shaped us, I have a couple of high school classmates, and we often talk about political science and economics teacher, Mr. Parel. He just opened the world to us. He made us think about puzzles we hadn't thought about before. And in hindsight, I would realize how interdisciplinary they were. He would make us think of the arts, political science, economics, technologies, all at the same time. So I went into programs that were interdisciplinary. And I guess taking off from those two factors, I would say I had certain kind of affinity for things that were imaginative and creative. And, techne in our technology in Greek is art. And so I've just always been fascinated by human endeavors that were imaginative, tried to solve problems. I really find myself at home if I can go from arts to artificial intelligence. Sometimes it's the same thing these days, and so it's the sense of perhaps in these solutions, in the way we think about all of this, we can find solution to human problems. I've written a couple of books on UNESCO, and that's just an example of an organization which has education, science, culture in its agenda, and it thinks across the board on all of those issues. My dissertation, which then resulted in my very first book, was called Leapfrogging Development with a question mark. And it was about telecommunications. Because when I was growing up in the small places that I was mentioning earlier, we didn't have telephones. Telephones came much later. Our neighbor got a telephone, and we just sort of treated it like a community telephone. Anybody who was going to get, at that time, what was called a trunk call, would give the neighbor's number, and somebody would come over and say, you have a call, and we'd go over. But the idea that in the 1980s and 1990s in India or other places in the development, that technology would be so essential to all sorts of human endeavors, from agriculture to trade to global governance, it was surprising. So but I wasn't sure if it held the promise that it was touted to. And so my dissertation, which then resulted in this book, was about, can countries leapfrog with these technologies? And as most academics do, we said, under what conditions? So it was a safe but hopefully empirically vetted answer to say, under these conditions, perhaps we can leapfrog, and then under these conditions, perhaps not. And so that's been sort of the trajectory. So growing up in small town India in a post-colonial climate, getting an interdisciplinary training and being absolutely fascinated with human imagination. So the things I would point out as the inflection points, as you said, Stephen.
I mean, that's really, really fascinating. I can see how you're shaped in the 60s. You're in India, and India is still was, and it's very formative in many respects from the post-colonial sort of era. And I can see that would produce challenges and a whole bunch of opportunities as well. And the fact that your family was in horticulture. So, and you mentioned mushrooms. Do you work with the Sona group by any chance, or some people within that sort of conglomerate?
No, I don't, but I know Manish. And so he was trained in public health, the person, you're talking about the restaurants, right? Or no, not that group. I apologize if we're on the wrong track. But no, I haven't worked with them, but I would say the developing world in particular has all these people who are trying very hard. Now, oftentimes that's the story that gets missed or is told in a surprising fashion. Startups coming from Africa or Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa is full of startups these days. Drone technology is being deployed in Tanzania. These shouldn't be surprises to us. These are human beings trying very hard to think a way out of whatever condition they're born in, and for me, that was the India I was growing up in. The mushroom story is just another example of a technology that's brought in in both kinds of good and bad ways. First time my father brought home mushrooms, we laughed and said, "You're trying to poison us," because that was one part of Indian cuisine. But somewhere along the way, somebody in Europe or some place in the United Nations said India should grow cash crops. And if they grow mushrooms, they can be canned and exported to the Middle East, and they would earn far more money than basmati rice or lentils or fresh vegetables. And that's how that was brought in. But I think what's common to the mushroom story is a bunch of other stories. If India had special economic zones, if India could link up with Microsoft in Bangalore, if India could do something else, which was not just about working in a small land holding, that there might be a way out. So these technologies have been proposed for a long time, and now we have the newest set of them. And the question becomes, how will they be used? They all hold promises, they all hold challenges, they all have weaknesses, and the question always is, who will get them, and how will they be used? And there'll be what I'm particularly concerned with in my scholarship is it's not just an instrument like an X that does Y things. It's also something transformative. It changes the meaning of what that X is, that what we're doing. So it's not that AI is going to transform the workplace. It changes the very nature of work, what we call work, the idea of going to an office, the idea of labor, the idea of organizing capital. So there's also a transformational effect that often gets missed if we just say a technology is going to have the following effects, which are often about an instrument being put to use. We have to think also about these meta level effects, which are very transformative, which change the meaning of our lives and who we are and what we do and why we do it. So I've been very concerned with those kinds of meanings as well, and the transformations that come about.
I mean, India has gone through a tremendous amount of change, and I guess when you were younger, you had the opportunity to receive education, and then you got education abroad, and you're a professor at quite a famous university in the U.S., but you've done so much more. Was it your family that enabled all of that, or was there other circumstances that allowed you, especially in the early days, because India at the time didn't have as much opportunity, right? So what was that like to sort of break through and to study abroad and to get those opportunities to study abroad? And in those days, again, it was much harder, right? So, or maybe I'm mistaken.
Oh, no, you're not. In fact, as I said in the beginning, I grew up in small town, rural India. I'm not coming from Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore, Chennai, etc., where sort of India's elite congregates. My family was educated, but we were middle-income Indians. I was growing up in places where there weren't these sort of finest of schools like IITs in India. So part of my education was moving from Hindi language. So I didn't speak a word of English until grade 7 or so. And I knew the alphabet, but I didn't speak it as a language. Now I think in English. So I've now, in hindsight, I feel really privileged that I went through the entire gamut of experiences in India. I can still go back to my village where I have a house and just connect immediately with the people who are working small land holdings, and they're growing vegetables, trying to figure out how to send them to markets and cut out sort of the middle levels. And that's been a story for the last 60 years since I've been growing up. These small land holding farmers who are trying to reach regional or local or international markets. So that was important growing up for me. There were times in my life when I thought, well, I wish I'd grown up in Delhi. Wish I'd gone to all these really fancy schools. I did. I had an opportunity to go to some very fancy schools later on. That was the trajectory. And because my parents came from an educated family, that was very important to them. And I don't think it was just my family. It's I think now what we would call these middle-income groups all over the world. Education was the way out. So that was the way you got skill sets, you began to see the world. And now that we've seen these kind of encroachings on this, what we're calling deglobalization, etc., and whatever term we use, I was growing up in a world in which we were asked to think about global imaginaries. The world was open, and that's what education did. It was not a threatening place. It was an aspirational world. I'm also growing up in an India, which at the same level, one might argue, was closed to the world, because in India and a lot of the developing world at that time, and also East Asian experience was similar, they would close themselves from the rest of the world. They would have an sort of indigenous industrialization strategy. In India's case, in other countries, it was called import substitution industrialization. You weren't going to import. Instead, you were going to manufacture. So in China's case, it's going to be bicycles, not cars. In India's case, also intermediate technologies were going to be it. So there was, then it became infamously, in India's case, the license quota permit Raj. The British had left, but all of that needed to be regulated. So they came about a central government, which seemed just a little too dirigist, a little too commanding heights, and India produced growth rates that were derided as the Hindu rate of growth. Similarly, in China, it was the Confucian rate of growth. These were people hypothesized and said, oh, these countries would never grow because culturally they can't. And now you have a China with a Confucian rate of growth, which is often in the double digits. And similarly, perhaps in India, I look back on it, and Stephen, like many others, I was training myself in economics, and we were against these central planning instruments because they weren't allowing markets to grow. In hindsight, now I have a slightly more favorable view of that kind of climate in which we are thinking about India's place in the world, as well as a very indigenous strategy. And because it allowed people to gain the necessary confidence to do things on their own. No, I think that's what Gandhi and Nehru and these post-colonial, not just in India, but post-colonial leaders all over the world, it was Joseph Nkrumah in Ghana, or Leopold Senghor in Senegal, or Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. These were, yes, they were nationalist leaders, but they thought about what the colonial experience had done and what countries needed to do to step forward. And they borrowed from a whole sort of global ideas on that, this international development thinking. But part of that thinking was people will need to have confidence on their own. Nehru's book, Discovery of India, he's coming back after his British education. That discovery is about finding himself. And you find that in the stories of a lot of the nationalist leaders, but even those who weren't famous. What am I going to do to change the world? And part of that was these indigenous efforts. So you probably know the name Sam Pitroda. He goes back to India. He is one of the czars of Indian telecom efforts starting in the early 1980s. And, one thing he did was to think about India's vast engineering force, and could he come up with these small 128 line switches or 512 line switches, which would be useful for India's rural areas. Whether that experiment succeeded or not, the idea was that it provided a way for people to think about, are there indigenous solutions? Where can we lend human creativity? And I think since the 90s in India, or 80s onwards in China, that effort began to bear fruit with more opening, with allowing people to do more things. There's still huge numbers of problems, politically, economically, but as I said earlier, the very experience which I thought in the beginning was very constrictive because it was too top down. I think of it now as perhaps it was necessary to have gone through that phase, to have gathered that confidence. And now when you pick up the Financial Times in the morning, and Modi's coming to the United States now on a state visit, and his energy coal minister is lecturing the United States on double standards. And this is front page FT News today. There's some hypocrisy there, yes. But on the other hand, it's also an India, or you could say Brazil or Ghana, anywhere, which learned to speak. They learned to find a voice of its own. I'm personally pleased that once they did, they also found markets. They also found that there are other ways of organizing human efforts and labor and capital. And but I as I was saying, now I think of these efforts as building on a past where there was a bit of a closing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then sort of an opening up. But even that closing had a global element. It was informed with global ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, India now has surpassed China as the most populous country in the world, right? And has a tremendous growth rate, and a lot of innovation startups coming out of India. If you look at the CEOs of the largest companies in the world that are in technology, including in America, they have Indian roots, right? So, yeah, and yet the civilization and the culture goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? One of the oldest cultures in the world today, and even now. What are your thoughts about that? All of the learnings of the past, some of them lost, and yet now a rediscovery, right, or appreciation of the millennia of eras ago, where there's so much learning and wisdom and capabilities that are percolating again and being recognized. Or what you're thinking about that, and do you think there's going to be a realization of that, such a rich history? And if you look at some of the other countries around the world, the Western ones, they were really quite recent compared to India or China and so on.
Yeah, and I think you used just the term that should make us all think, and I think it's appropriate, that rediscovery. Now, I do a lot of work, as I said, on culture, because culture is these symbols, values, artifacts that make us think of who we are. And sometimes we arrest them in static sort of imaginaries, that there's something very static about culture. So when we speak of a Hindu rate of growth or a Confucian rate of growth, we think it's static. I think cultures are really malleable. Cultures take on global influences. Cultures change. Cultures are many things, but embedded in those things is, as you said, civilizations. And the longue durée style of history from France spoke of these long periods in history in which civilizations shaped themselves. And and Ferdinand Braudel at one time, or perhaps the founder of this school, spoke of the stimulating impact of strangers. What that does to a place when ideas come in that were not there, and they become assimilated and they grow over time. So I think that as we think of Indian culture too, that history has lots and lots of influences that came from 12th century onwards. You had successive sets of people come from Central Asia, the Sultanate period in India, the Mughal rule in India. Then now we know historically that even in ancient India, there were people who sort of came from the Caucasus region. That's why at one time the word Caucasian implied anybody from Europe to parts of South Asia. So people have moved. We've found this set of Indo-Germanic languages. The word Himalaya and Himmel in German have connections. So cultures, yes, they take on local character, but they also have these international dimensions. And because they're malleable, oftentimes we can create a narrative out of culture that can provide an impetus, to put it in sort of very simple terms, economic growth or development, or thinking about technology. Oh, we've done this in the past. We can go back to the roots and say this was done in the past. And therefore now, so there's in India now a rediscovery of Hinduism in a way it never took place. Some of it is laughable. We've had leaders say, oh, but in the Vedic era, they flew planes. And I'm sure somebody's going to come over and say artificial intelligence was invented in the Indus Valley civilization. I'm sure it was. And so there's that part of rediscovery of culture. But there's also a positive part. Not that I'm saying that's negative. Maybe it allows a few people to say, yes, we've always done it. But there's, I guess, a more positive way of going about it would be to rediscover in one's culture things that are going to make you grow. Think of naming the world. Yes, we know the Weberian ethic, the Protestant ethic in Europe allowed Europe to have an industrial revolution. But then we also know in the rediscovery of culture that surely, yes, industrial revolution might have begun and taken off in England, but many of the discoveries that fed into the industrial revolution came from Catholic Italy. That was the one which built those great domes. That was the place which came up with those universities. So we can rediscover those things in Catholicism. We can rediscover them in Protestantism. We can discover them in Hinduism. So one way for one to think about culture is how the very same value at one time, which might have inhibited our understanding of technology, whether it was gazing at the stars or an instrument in another period, might actually encourage it. And then one must think of kind of the enabling conditions that will allow one to gaze at the stars and come up with an astronomical instrument versus just gaze and go back to sleep, which might also be fine. And for me, those are rules that politics designs, which allow people to do things that they want to do. They're markets in which you can transact things. I mean, they're simple things, but we've had this notion of a market since we've had human beings in a way, this idea that we can exchange things, we don't have to do everything ourselves. And as these new technologies come about, artificial intelligence being one of our newest, yes, there may be there may be a newness to them, but in a way, they're products of places, they're products of conditioning factors around us, be they markets or politics. Another story I read this morning, Gideon Rachman from Financial Times, speaking of how Europe has fallen, continues to fall behind the United States. And the two of the things he mentioned in it were, one, the rankings of universities, that when you look at the Shanghai rankings or the Times Higher Education rankings, most of them are in the United States. And while he's not saying it, there's a kind of an openness to making these institutions grow in the United States, whether it's education, whether it's labor, whether it's capital, finance, etc., that may not be. And one cultural story of the United States that often is told is that openness. So that may be a way of thinking about culture and the institutions, and thinking about the politics and the rules that come about as a result, which then shape our understanding of how the world looks right now.
But you can see the future, though, really being India and China and Asia in some aspects, and I can see Africa as well, but particularly in Asia right now, because you have this kind of common entrepreneurship spirit, definitely a respect for education. In India, there is this aspect that you're the largest English-speaking country in the world. Within China, there's this mandate of people sort of speaking a common language and so on, even though there's all these different dialects and different ethnic groups, but there's this attempt to do that. So you get into this socioeconomic evolution where, innovation is really a subject of the number of people involved. Do you have a commonality in thinking, a common language, and you can get an escalation in technical innovation. And then there's this idea that that's why in some parts of the world where you have 1,000 different dialects and tribes that are too small, so you don't have enough critical mass for innovation to percolate or to continue to be instigated, which means then really India is going to be a catalyst for a tremendous amount of innovation, or in Asia, a tremendous amount of innovation. And in fact, you're going to end up leading the world, right? And the rate of innovation, the amount of innovation do you think about that at all? Or what are your thoughts on that really all of the critical pieces are in place to be number one in the world and going into the future?
Yeah, no, we do. In fact, the Minerva project that I mentioned earlier is substantially about that, and I'll get to that in a second. But something that you mentioned here is extremely important, which is that it's important to recognize the kinds of efforts that are going on in India and China, which are not just imitative. Oftentimes in the West, the story gets told as if they're just stealing everything, or there's intellectual property being taken up, and sure, that carries on. So did the United States. There were intellectual property rights infringements. Charles Dickens came to the United States and said, please stop doing these cheap products called paperbacks, because these need to be leather-bound classics, and poor guy was starving. And so we've, in some ways, imitation makes for great innovation, but that's not the only story. China and India also have great educational institutions, histories of that. And not just China, India, I think other places do too. You can go around the world. I mentioned UNESCO. If you look at the World Heritage Sites, they're not just confined to the West. Each place has a history from which it can draw its confidence, but also a set of skills that existed. Something else that you sort of mentioned in passing, which is very important, people working really hard. I think China and India offer that story. Many times when you don't get into an IIT in India, you come to the United States to a top-level engineering institution because it's so hard to get into an Indian Institute of Technology. That tells you something about how hard it is, these competitive examinations in which you spend days and months studying so you would get in there. And China invented the bureaucracy, this system of mandarins, this a bureaucracy that would be competent enough to provide governance. And so these are culture civilizations that do have a long history of endeavors. That said, And here's where I'm going to put my now American hat on, because I've been here since 1984. I'll be honest, I like democracies. I like liberalism. I think in the end, you can force innovation through the barrel of a gun, but it's better to foster it through open societies. And I would think that systems that are autocratic, you wonder, we have evidence through history that they do it, but they're unsustainable. They fall apart because the fit between human endeavor and the political system that shapes that endeavor, it doesn't quite always work. So if we say how US or Western Europe, etc., got it right, it was a human endeavor that grew along with a political system that fostered successive rounds of innovation, that had educational systems that were open. You could wonder about the world, and you could come up with inventions. Some of them may be nonsense, others were great. But the Enlightenment project, the modernity project, they were about societies thinking simultaneously. Now, I could be wrong, Stephen. It could be that from 21st century onwards, autocratic systems would call the shots on innovation. That's grand thinking. So I'll turn to my Minerva project now. What we've been doing there is micro level thinking, more granular thinking about how are countries shaping their national level AI infrastructures. So we've done computer science modeling. We're using AI to analyze AI. We're looking at all of the texts that are coming out from various countries on their national AI infrastructures. And what we find there is, yes, there are a couple of grand stories to be told. Countries that are not pluralist tend to think of the AI infrastructures in a slightly different way than countries that are pluralist. So, for example, there are more convergences between US and EU strategy than there is between US and Chinese strategy. But on the other hand, when you really dig deeper into it, and we've called this, the metaphor we're using is AI wardrobes, how countries are putting together their AI wardrobes. It actually came from one of my PhD students, Caroline Wesson, who said, well, shall we call them AI wardrobes? All countries are trying to put these wardrobes together. And in that wardrobe, they're trying to think of startups, they think of unicorns, they're thinking of conglomerates, they're thinking of the education systems, they're thinking about their basic research, they think about where the finance element is going to come from, they think about the political system. So all countries are trying different kinds of approaches. And while we can tell a grand story between pluralist versus non-pluralist systems, you also find at the granular level, countries begging and borrowing from it. Well, they tried this and maybe we should try that too. So how do we emerge from that? You still find that pluralist systems tend to foster more innovation. Now, and so in that sense, China seems more like an anomaly. And it is unclear if India slides backwards from democracy as it seems to have done so. Could it continue that level of innovation that it has done? Will, for example, businesses say, well, property rights are not so secure in India, so we can't go there? No, because that's what it boils down to. At the end, you want your capital to be secure. And we find that pluralist systems are better able to secure that capital than non-pluralist systems. So for me, and that's why I started by saying I'll put on my American hat, I'm fascinated with the way that the growth of liberalism in the West went hand in hand with industrialization to now the fourth industrial revolution. And you find still that while, yes, there are grand narratives, within these pluralist systems also there are micro-level approaches. European Union's approach to AI is slightly different from that of the US, but both US and EU have points of convergences which China doesn't have, or another country might not have. So it's fascinating to see how these countries are thinking about this, how they're begging and borrowing, and then being able to step back and say, at a broad level, you're also able to see these differences that you wouldn't otherwise, unless you got to the grassroots, unless you got into the weeds and started looking at those differences.
So throughout this discussion, you've been talking about this Minerva program. It's a $1.39 million grant. Can you describe how it came about. You talked about some of the objectives of it. What do you hope to achieve with this $1.3 million grant? How will it impact? Who are the stakeholders involved? And how do you think it's going to make a contribution in shaping, what's going to happen in the future? And then just as a context to the audience, you're a Fulbright Nehru Professional Excellence Award winner, an Outstanding Scholar Award from the Shar School, Distinguished Scholar in International Communications, the International Studies Association. You previously taught at the University of Edinburgh, Georgetown University, American University, University of Mississippi, Scripps College, and you're a distinguished professor at George Mason. You're a fellow with the Robert Bosch Academy Berlin. You're the co-director of the Center for Advanced Human-Machine Partnership, and you've written all of these books and articles, which we'll mine in the remaining time. But now let's focus on this Minerva program. Why is it so important to you? Who put this up?
Thank you, first of all, for the list that you just gave. But it's been an honor to have indulged in all of these activities. The Minerva grant comes from DoD. In the United States, from the Department of Defense, and it was a program that was started under Secretary Gates. I think 2008 is when he fostered it. A lot of the U.S. agencies or ministries, as they would be called around the world, have their own grants programs. For the United States, the most famous is obviously National Science Foundation, NIH, NEA, etc. But it was a way for the Department of Defense to bring in social scientists to thinking about broad security questions. And we now know, for example, DoD can claim that DARPA invented the internet, and a lot of the innovations have come from that realm. And it was a way of engaging the social scientists with kind of the more technical teams that have been traditionally involved in DoD. In the beginning, I think there was a slight reticence on the part of social scientists, as you can imagine, to collaborate with the Department of Defense. But over time, it's become a very prestigious program. And we were just very excited to have gone through. There's several rounds that you go through, an internal round within universities where they'll select a couple of proposals to move forward. And then you turn in a 3-page white paper to DoD. Then they select a few out of that. And then they fund, about around 15 teams per year. And we have a large team of over 10 people. My team involves people from security, from ethics. I was trained in political economy. We have a natural language processing person, a machine learning person, those are the faculty, but then we have graduate students who are also receiving this training. Our idea was to look at the determinants of these national AI infrastructures. OECD has a repository right now of countries that have announced national level AI policies, oftentimes as documents that have come about from these countries. But also there are what we would call intranational strategies. There may be commissions, agencies, government ministries, or departments that have AI strategies. So there are countries that have strategies on autonomous vehicles or education, workforce training, retraining, finance, etc. So our idea was to say, let's see these as texts, as these narratives, the stories that these countries are telling. And then you can see why I need the computer scientists to do this modeling for me, this or text mining, to see what's going on in them. So in very simple terms, what we've done so far is topic modeling, LDA models, which tell us what are the topics that stand out in these national AI infrastructures. And looking at them, we're able to then see that granularity that I was mentioning earlier, because topics appear as probabilities of words that will frequently co-occur together. So one can imagine that when the topic of ethics comes up, or surveillance, transparency, accountability, you can see how the European Union documents dominate in that. When the topic of talent comes up, that was one of the topics that we got from the documents, is dominated with Chinese documents. Developing talent. And so we're able to then see which countries are emphasizing what kind of an approach, and then we're able to then see these determinants of it. Why is it that these countries took that on? That then takes us into kind of the second phase of our research. Once we find out what's happening, then we have to explain why is it happening that way, and that will take successive modeling from now onwards. We've only had 1 year in this project. Part of it is process tracing, meeting with the decision makers, be they in business or government. And my Fulbright Nehru Award that I went for in India allowed me to go back to India and speak to NASSCOM, which is sort of the foremost business organization in India, or government people, or think tanks, agencies. The Wadhwani brothers have started Wadhwani Institute for AI in Mumbai. So I was able to meet with them to see what they're doing. So that allows for process tracing in terms of, okay, this is where India is headed, and I can show you why. Over time, we want to do it more quantitatively and be able to come up with models which will say, if country X were to change one particular dimension of where they are, this is how it will affect everything else. Because that's kind of what we did with traditional mathematical techniques, or in economics, what we call econometrics. We were able to specify a whole set of explanatory variables, parameters, and say, this little parameter will do the following today. If the interest rate drops by 0.25%, these will be the effects. So then we can see, if we say, if country X were to announce a strategy on data ethics, this is the effect it'll have on the rest. And with the kind of computer science techniques they're developing, we should be able to do that in the future. So we, for now, limited ourselves to looking at what's going on in these national AI strategies. But in the future, we want to have more predictive models about, here's where we think countries will head, or be able to forecast and say, if they were to change a particular dimension, then we're likely to see the following effects. That will, I think, provide policymakers, regulators, the global watchers, some certainty about where countries are headed in terms of these infrastructures.
That's a really fascinating idea and a program, and you're doing research in it, and you do have some, you've even indicated, you can see sort of this talent focus out of China. You can see this policy, regulatory, ethical framework kind of idea percolating in the EU, and you can see the results of that. There are AI law, regulation, there are GDPR stuff before that. Right. And I guess Canada was the first out with a national AI policy, right? And so you see these different countries with these, areas that they deem of importance. So are you then able to publish some of this work early, so that like there's an AI for Good conference, there's all these workshops and events happening. Are you going to do some intervention there and saying, by the way, this country, this is a list of countries, and this is what we're seeing where things are going? Or are you going to be to produce some intermediate results, or do you have to wait?
You're right on it. So we, as academics, we do our research, we sit by our computers, we get the results. And the traditional way of publishing this, which is what we expected to do with this, was you send it off to peer-reviewed journals, and 1 year after you get the first set of results, then those come out, and you get these critiques from your peers, which are very helpful in terms of shaping it. So that's where we were headed. But when we presented these results at any conference, the demand for the results has been so strong that now we are hoping that we can get a policy report out as quickly as possible, which won't have the kind of theoretical framework that we would do in our scholarly publication. So hopefully by next month, we'll have a policy publication out. If I can be non-humble here, we would be the first team in the world to show what's going on in these infrastructures. And I think it will be a bulwark, a pushback against the kind of articles that we're seeing in popular media about AI is all good, all bad. And these days it's all bad. And that's fine, but it needs to be backed with evidence. And what we have is evidence which doesn't point in one or the other direction. As you said, there are various ways of thinking about ethics, and European Union has done a good job of pushing that GDPR framework out to many countries in the world. And you see that showing up as in various infrastructures, references to GDPR. And similarly, when we did this analysis at various levels. So at the document level, we got various topics back from our LDA modeling. And there was a topic called education, and all sorts of countries' reports showed up. There were mostly reports from ministries of education thinking about AI and education at elementary school level or high school level, college level, or workforce retraining. But then there was another topic, and we call that topic talent, because that's what stood out in that. And those were all Chinese level documents. And what that pointed out to us was that the way that the world is thinking about education is very different from the way that China is thinking about AI training. And so it's very focused. It's about talent development to do something. Whereas when you read education reports from around the world, they can vary from very broad, abstract thinking about problem solving to we need to retrain the workers to get new sets of skills, etc. But I think we need that level of analysis, so we just don't say, well, this is just a hand, and the AI is just a tool at the hands of autocracies, or it's just going to foster innovation. We don't know if GDPR would foster innovation. I won't name the country, but we were consulting with them, and they were saying, yes, we've adopted the GDPR framework. We find it very restrictive in terms of innovation. On the other hand, Estonia is within the European Union, and they have grown by leaps and bounds with the GDPR framework. So it may not be an either or answer, whether GDPR restrictive or not restrictive for innovation. It could be that certain players like Estonia can work within the GDPR framework and have very high levels of innovation, become a global player as they have in AI, whereas another country might not be able to. So the idea of research here would be to say, what are the conditions under which GDPR would foster innovation? What are the conditions under which it won't? You mentioned the European Union framework that's still developing in terms of AI. Well, when ChatGPT came out, a lot of that was moot already because that regulation won't work. And now we know from theories of regulation that oftentimes regulation is too late. Technology is moved ahead. The way that a lot of countries have gotten it right is to have the kind of regulation that meets demands from the past, but leaves open possibilities for future innovation. And we're still trying to figure out what that would mean in the AI environment. And the EU approach has been more precautionary, more preventive, and we saw hints of that in the US as well, with Elon Musk and others signing a letter saying go slow. But the US approach has always been, I think not always, but mostly been sort of one step behind technology, but letting more of an openness to letting it grow. But again, the thing I would emphasize would be, I think what research can teach us here is look at the granularity and think of the conditions under which something grows and doesn't grow, rather than a very broad framework saying this will not work or that will not, because under different conditions, different things work.
I realize now we could have a 3-hour discussion, and we only have about 8 minutes left, so 7 or 8 minutes left. And we could spend just a whole session on this Minerva program, and let's do an interview when you are able to release some of the more granular data in this thing, and we'll look and sort of examine it. I think it's just fascinating, the work. And we have exascale supercomputers. They're already out, and these are ones that can do 1 billion operations per second. And I can see zettascale and maybe by 2025. You have NVIDIA already releasing their GDX Grace Hopper 200 module. That one module, it's an exascale peak performance system just on its own, and you could string a bunch of these together, right? So, or Microsoft with their AI supercomputer has 250 285,000 CPU cores, 8,000 GPU cores. They have their new AI Athena chip. So you have this whole sort of chip stuff that's exploding 3D architectures. You have supercomputers, so probably go zettascale. I'm thinking now by 2025, that's 1 trillion billion operations per second. These are like unheard of numbers. Then you have things like DeepMind with AlphaFold 2, and they release 200 million proteins, that amino acids folding into proteins, and you understand the structure. That means so much or ESM Fold with over 600 million proteins being released. And up to this point in the lab, there was like 200,000, and it took 50 years, right? So there's all of this convergence. And then you have biomedical innovation, the convergence there that's happening. And then you also have the large foundation models of which ChatGPT is one, or GPT-4. You have Gemini being worked on ahead of Palm 2. It's being concurrent. I did an interview on quantum computing with Tony Utley of Quantinuum, which used to be Honeywell Quantum, but they merged with Cambridge. But Honeywell was still the sort of the majority owner of this thing, and he's saying they're working on current technology, the next one after that concurrently. They actually built them all, and their second generation is 1 trillion times better than the first generation, and the third generation, which they've already built, is 1 trillion times better than the second generation. And he's saying that in 5 years, all of these will be available, right? Right now, the first, and now they just released the second generation, so people can start working with it. But the third generation is 1 trillion times better than the first generation. And in my interview with them, he indicated that they're going to now solve probably condensed matter physics or some. And condensed matter physics is things like semiconductors and superfluids and superconductors. And these are really practical. So he's saying now, practical applications now. So, you're talking about AI, but really it's a convergence of all of these things coming together. So do you look at that convergence, and you're transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary? So it's no longer these silos anymore. All of these work together, right? So.
Right. Yeah, no, and by the way, your ability to recount these statistics is just absolutely genius levels. It's just an admiration. We do and we don't. Task of research always is to focus on one thing while keeping the meta context in mind. And so that one context was, what do these national levels strategies look like? But examining national AI infrastructures in the present era is very different from looking at national telecom strategies in 1980s, where we said, of course, fishermen in Kerala can get prices for their fish if they were able to call on their mobile phones and did a price search. It's no longer the same. In an AI environment is not just your ability to do searches, but being able to transform everything that you're doing at a level of computational power that didn't belong. And then there are these meta questions that you're bringing up. Where's this research going to get done? And the blurring of lines between what we used to call basic research, which always got done at these sort of science institutes, versus the applied research. And all universities are aware now that their sort of competence in the past to be able to do the basic research no longer exists, because Microsoft may be able to do. I've had colleagues say, wow, I had this grant from NSF and Microsoft or Google just released these results. What I'm doing is just moot now, and they're able to do it at a computational level, which I possibly couldn't, even with 20 graduate assistants. So that's blurred, and I think that's going to change. That's why I said earlier, it's very important for us to keep in mind these transformational effects, because it's not just how universities will prepare themselves for the age of AI. Another question is, what will education look like, and who will be doing it, and how will it be done? That said, I think, again, it's very important to come down to a granular level to think about it. One of the stories I was hearing in India was that India is very good at a startup scene for preparing apps, but they're not able to do that product level innovation that you just mentioned. It just doesn't have the infrastructure, the mathematics PhDs, the physics PhDs, the bioinformatics PhDs that it's going to need to get there. Similar story in Germany, by the way, where I've done a lot, because they are trying their hardest to get that very high level skill set to come to Germany, but for a variety of factors, it's been a trickle so far. And our people in Germany might dispute that, but they're still struggling with it. So I think that while we think about what a country may or may not be capable of doing, it's all, and how these transformational effects oftentimes are mind-boggling, because it might point to, well, these lines are blurred, universities no longer matter. There are still some basic questions we can ask. Who is best prepared to do it? All the businesses that you mentioned, I think all of them were US. Why? What is it about the United States that they're able to do it, but not a Germany or an India? So I think that's a level at which we can start to provide more sensible answers to where we're headed next and who will be able to do it and not be able to do it.
Yeah, and again, my mind just thinking now of Alpaca that came from Stanford, which is an open source model. It's about 70% of the capability of ChatGPT, and then you have Vicuna, and Alpaca was trained for under $600. Wow. And where these large models are 100 million plus, right? And Vicuna, open source, it's about 85% of the capability of ChatGPT, and it was trained for $300, and you could do it on your laptop, right? And then there's this new one called Orca just came out, and it's actually can outperform, and it's open source. So what is the meaning of all of that and the impact? Anyways, we could. We're going to have to do part 2 or 3 if you're willing.
Right.
To get into your current project as Development 4.0. Talk about your work at the university and some of the other things that you're doing. We're at the end of this interview. In fact, I've got another one coming just after this. So a quick final words from you, and hopefully you agree, and let's continue this conversation.
Well, Steve, first of all, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I hope to have this policy report done next month, and so hopefully I can just send it to you. So should you not get the time to do another interview, you could hyperlink the policy report to it. And we're just in conversations right now about how and where it will be published. And so I should have that in hand by next month. So that hopefully would be a contribution to add to this interview. But it's been a pleasure for me, an honor to have talked. Thank you.
Thank you, JP. Thanks for coming in. I really, really enjoyed our time together. Please take care.
Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.